Hello and welcome to The Sun Will Rise. I'm Roshan Mohammed Salih. As we all know, Gaza has been the victim of yet another Israeli bombardment with huge damage done yet again to civilian life and infrastructure under the pretext of fighting terrorism. And while the bombs have rained down on Gaza, the media war has also been raging on the airwaves, in newspapers and websites and on social media. The traditional Western media giants, especially such as the BBC, have come under unprecedented criticism for their alleged pro-Israeli bias. They, meanwhile, insist that their coverage is free, fair, accurate, objective and balanced. On today's show, we'll discuss what Palestinians think about the way the media has covered this conflict and if the criticisms of Western outlets have any merit. But first, here's Nell Burden reporting from the West Bank on how Palestinians view the coverage of recent events.
Following the killing of 3 Israeli settlers in the West Bank and the subsequent burning alive of 15-year-old Palestinian Mahmoud Abu Khader in a revenge killing, a crisis escalated in the West Bank and Israel as Palestinians demonstrated in the streets and were met with heavy-handed violence by the Israeli police. During this period, the Israeli army made military incursions in the West Bank, arresting over 500 members of Hamas. From the outset of Israel's offensive on Gaza, dubbed Operation Protective Edge, international media, particularly US and British outlets, were accused of portraying serious bias towards Israel, while ignoring the rising fatality count of Palestinians, including innocent civilians.
The media, with the start of that war, will be controlled immediately by the military control or military monitoring. And none of any international or Western reporter can send or even film anything unless it will be approved by the Israeli military.
On Tuesday evening, we made a mistake.
The US ABC News was fiercely criticized by Palestinians and rights groups. The initial reports on Gaza portrayed bombed Gaza homes as Israeli homes and claimed it was the Israelis fleeing from aerial attacks. It was only after intense pressure from social media that ABC News withdrew the video and apologized for sending misinformation.
There is no balanced media coverage of Gaza war right now. There are no breaking news, and in every 20 or 30 reports, media reports, there is something on Gaza. And if there is something on Gaza, you find there something that maybe explains, maybe something that says something about what Israel wants, or something that they pass what Israel says in their reports.
TVs and media is broadcasting Gaza war from many angles. For example, media in the world is covering the war in a bad way, that is showing Palestinians as if they're terrorists.
Jenna explained that although Israelis censor all international news from the country, it is social media that has been most progressive during the bombing of Gaza, and that hashtag and trending has ensured that Palestinians can tip the balance of media coverage.
With the Israeli assault on Gaza now intensifying and the fatality rate rising at a rapid rate, Palestinian media analysts say it is only now the Western media is catching up with the rising death toll in Gaza. Melbourne for The Sun Will Rise, occupied Ramallah.
To discuss the media coverage of the Gaza crisis, we have 2 guests with us in the studio today. Hafsa Kara Mustafa is an Arab journalist and a specialist on the politics of the Middle East. And Masood Chajre is the chair of the Islamic Human Rights Commission and the organizer of the annual Al-Quds or Jerusalem Day March in London. Thanks for joining me today. Hafsa, if I can come to you first. What do you make of the media coverage of the Gaza conflict so far?
I think it's been absolutely shameful coming from the mainstream outlets. We are seeing a complete double standard. We're seeing a country that is being pounded, victims, 200 essentially civilian victims, and there seems to be, from the mainstream media, a sort of parallel between the two sides, where it is a clear-cut case of an oppressed people facing a brutal attack from an occupying force. So I think it's fair to say that the BBC essentially, which is sort of has some sort of moral responsibility as being the mainstream UK media, has been particularly disappointing in actually fueling that idea that there's sort of an equal conflict. And I think that the protest, which was outside their headquarters a while back, actually clearly indicates that there is anger from the viewers who are now who have more access to raw images coming straight from Gaza, and they're actually witnessing that they're being lied to.
I mean, the BBC isn't here today. I mean, we will hear a lot of anger directed towards the BBC in reports later on in this programme. But they've come out with a statement saying that actually they reject these criticisms. They do allow both sides to voice their concerns and say their pieces on news bulletins, and they stand by their reporting.
But that's the problem. They are actually putting the two sides on an equal footing when there is a clear case of an oppressed people facing brutal aggression. So this idea that they're actually putting the two sides equally is in itself wrong. I mean, you've had the Jimmy Savile scandal. Would you actually bring a string of victims and saying, well, did you actually, were you starstruck? Maybe you were actually encouraging Jimmy Savile? It would be preposterous to even encourage that idea. There are victims and there is the aggressor. So the idea that they continuously and actually accept that they're doing this sort of dual thing really is at the heart of the problem.
Masood, as we see from that report, I mean, Palestinians really are sick of the way their story is being covered, aren't they?
It's not just Palestinians. We are sick of it. I mean, I turn off TV. I'm a sort of political animal which likes to watch news on all channels, but I was finding it very difficult to actually stomach watching this. It's not just the empty claim that they want to be sort of neutral on this thing. The reality is that they are actually, the way they're presenting all the Palestinians as terrorists, and they're presenting Israelis as Democrats, and they're giving them justification for being involved in the war, but the terrorists are just mad people who just want to kill people. They have got no justification.
Have things got better, compared to the coverage 10 years ago? Has it got slightly more pro-Palestinian?
No, I think not to. The reason, there are other players at play as well. The Zionists have got an extremely well-oiled sort of machinery of propaganda, and therefore, no matter what happens, you can't be equally balanced because they've got huge propaganda machinery. They've got professionals involved both in military and outside, and indeed they have many people in the media. The reality is that the culture has been created now that presents Palestinians as barbaric and the Israelis as civilized. And this is what is pumped in our media day in, day out. And then, we have things like CNN, which, it's owned by the Zionists, run by Zionists. And, when you look at one of the biggest shareholder in the corporation, you see there's Israeli. So really there is no equality for Palestinians to be recognized as equal human beings, let alone their cause.
Okay. All right, we'll come back to this discussion in a few minutes' time, but we're going to move on because the Gaza crisis has aroused real passions here in the UK where we are, with thousands coming out onto the streets to denounce Israeli aggression as well as the media coverage of it. Luke Mason has been finding out what the protesters have been saying.
The brutal bombardment of Gaza by Israeli forces has killed many, many people. The belated media attention the BBC and Western media coverage has gotten the situation has sparked outrage, and many people are gathered here in central London today demanding justice and an end to the violence. As the day wore on, people kept arriving to show their support for Palestine. Nearly 10,000 protesters crammed central London next to the Israeli embassy, determined to make sure their voices were heard. Many were frustrated with the coverage the situation in Gaza has received.
It's appalling. I mean, they really do just take the Israeli government's line and say that is the truth. And then after the event, you might find something. But their initial response is always to blame the Palestinians, never the Israelis. It's always to talk about them under threat and never the deaths. The Palestinians never have names, they never have photos, they never have families, whereas Israelis are always poor victims.
Many of the protesters were particularly frustrated with the BBC.
I think it's typical. They'll always give unfair coverage. They'll always stick up for Zionists. They'll always portray it as, as a conflict between Hamas and Israel, but that's not the truth at all. It's an occupation, it's an apartheid, it's a racist apartheid state.
There were further protests across London, including a march in the BBC building in central London, where thousands of people united to condemn what they see as unfair reporting on the situation in Gaza, favourable to the Israeli point of view. The people of Palestine live in constant fear that they will be attacked, with hospitals in desperate need of medical supplies. Many Palestinians feel helpless and desperate to protect their families. Most people view the struggle of Palestine as a human issue that unites people from all religions and beliefs.
It is so, I haven't got the words to say. And it's I feel such shame that everything is doing in our name. Not only Gaza should go back, the whole land should go back for Palestinians. From the river to the sea, this is false Zionist propaganda. And we have to break this, show Jews and Muslims can live together.
Many people throughout Britain believe the attacks on Palestine are not receiving the coverage they need. They see the mainstream media institutions as portraying the conflict as an evenly matched battle, with both sides inflicting similar damage. But it's a hypocrisy that many people can no longer bear from the media that's the source for this mass protest. People across the world are marching, united with the Palestinians in their long struggle for justice. Luke Mason reporting for The Sun Will Rise.
Hafsa, before that report, you were saying that one failing of the BBC was that presenting as the two sides as equals, military equals, whatever. Another failing that a lot of people are talking about is the lack of kind of context that the Western media give when they're reporting on Israel-Palestine. They treat everything as a separate event, but they don't give the context of occupation and siege. Is that, you agree with that?
Very much so, and I think there have been statistics that have revealed that the average Briton actually even thinks that the Palestinians are occupying Israeli land. I mean, that's
incredible, isn't it?
Yeah. It is almost, you could almost laugh if it wasn't so tragic. And that obviously comes because the info that they're getting is actually not giving them the whole picture, which is that the Palestinians are occupied and the Israelis are doing the occupying. So again, it is very important to put context, to put what prompted this to happen, what prompted Hamas to do whatever it did.
Yeah, because the current focus on a lot of the Western media is these Hamas rockets going into quote-unquote civilian areas in Israel.
Well, that's the thing. It's as if suddenly guys from Hamas just wake up and say, well, let's throw inefficient rockets. Let's remind the viewers that they don't do anything, they don't do any damage. But the idea that somehow they're doing it out of the blue, they're not. They're reacting, and they're actually applying their right, entrenched in international law, to react and to oppose occupation. So they're doing it for a reason. They're doing it because they're victims of Israeli oppression and occupation.
Masood, I mean, if we can cut to the chase, would you go as far as to say that for the Western media, the BBC, etc., an Israeli life is worth more than a Palestinian life?
Yeah, absolutely. That is exactly what is happening. The culture have been
because they would be very offended if you said that to them, wouldn't they?
Well, you know, then they should actually show compassion towards the child that is killed in comparison to another child that has been killed. You know, the reality is that, you know, we have created this culture. This culture is already, we could blame it on media is created, or media is either part of it or promoter of it. Is that there is a racism there, that Palestinians are barbaric and, you know, they should be kept other side of the wall to protect this European sort of stock of civilized people who are the Zionists who are living there. And that, unfortunately, is the narrative which is being pumped in all the time. And the fact that, you know, the resistance have come as a result of occupation is completely forgotten. I mean, resistance didn't come first. Occupation came first, and resistance was a result of the occupation.
As a journalist yourself, Hafsa, do you see a difference between the American media and the British media? I mean, the American media seems much more gung-ho and blatantly biased, whereas the British media is a bit more subtle, isn't it?
Exactly. I think the Americans they've obviously taken the side of the Israelis, and the way it's portrayed in their media is that the Israelis are right and the Palestinians are wrong. So that's almost clear. It almost has the benefit of being honest in the fact that it's completely wrong and immoral, but that's their stance. The British media, on the other hand, sort of try to play this kind of balanced game, which again is almost more devious, because again it puts the onus on both sides to stop, both sides to return to calm, etc. So it has a more, it's almost as if the Americans are playing bad cop and the British media is doing the good cop scenario.
But I mean, as Masood says, that, I mean, CNN might be funded by Zionists, but the British Broadcasting Corporation isn't. So why are they so pro-Israeli?
Not, but we know that on the board there are many who are sort of part of either Conservative or Labour Friends of Israel. We know that, you know, Jane, well, let's not name any sort of journalists, but they have close relationships with members of Parliament or people in government who have strong links to Israel or the Israeli lobby. So that in itself is, you know, it's slightly more discreet perhaps, but the connection to Israeli interest is obviously there. That's undeniable. The other factor, of course, is that there is the idea that you have to follow the Israeli line, and people are walking on eggshells in order, in a bid not to sort of offend the Israelis.
Masood?
There is both internal and external pressure on BBC to behave in this way. Internally, there are people who have been put in a position of power and influence who are actually Zionist campaigners, you know, activists. You would never put, you know, similarly someone who's a Palestinian activist in that sort of position. That's from internal. From external, there is a whole mechanism of putting pressure on BBC day in, day out, systematically and professionally, to force them to be more pro-Israeli. But also, culturally, already as I explained, this biases actually exist. So putting all these things together, it would be impossible to get fair reporting.
Okay. All right. Well, again, we're going to come back to this discussion, but for the moment, we are moving on yet again because we really do value your views on this show. So Camelia Shambayati has been collating the comments you've been leaving on our social media pages, and here's what she found out.
Thank you, Roshan. Many people have taken to social media to express their outrage over the Western media coverage of the Israeli airstrikes on Gaza. And we've had passionate responses on our Facebook wall. Let's take a look. Billy from the UK says the BBC has lost total credibility. They do not represent what the British public think or see. Do not pay your licence fee. Meanwhile, Rima from Australia says people still defend the Israeli regime because Israel and its agents have had the mainstream media in their pockets for decades. They have successfully demonized the Palestinians and their cause. It is textbook apartheid. And finally, Kim from the US says only masters of deception can bring about this level of ignorance in human beings. Israelis are liars, thieves, and murderers. This is just what they do. And as Gaza has been trending on Twitter, I've come across all sorts of views. For example, Andrea from Ireland has said, I'm not surprised that the US is behind the Israeli attack on Gaza. They are truly brainwashed fools. In another tweet, David from the UK says, there must be a ceasefire, time for the UN Security Council to intervene. And Alison from the US saying, both sides are equally guilty of unlawful and unproductive violence. Hope for peace and safety for everyone involved. And in another pro-Israel tweet, Tom from US says, Israel has every right to defend itself. No one should expect any nation to tolerate such continued acts of terror. Meanwhile, someone who goes by the name Celtic says, and they say irony is dead. Dressing up war crimes as self-defense makes you complicit. That's all we have time for. And be sure to let us know what you think. You can send us an email, post comments on our Facebook page, or you can visit our Twitter page where you can follow us at Sun Will Rise Show for all the latest updates on Palestine. Back to you, Roshan.
Masood, do you think some of the kind of Western media tactics of, you know, interviewing Israeli spokesmen, et cetera, is rubbing off on the Arab media as well? Because it's almost as if they're kind of normalizing Israel, isn't it?
Yeah, this is the culture that actually, yes, it does. I think RT, you know, Press TV, and to some extent Al Jazeera is actually speaking to different audiences. But the point is this, that now we bring in the same bias that exists, i.e. the whole sort of propaganda machinery of Israelis, and giving them air on these channels, and that is totally unacceptable.
So you would deprive them of that oxygen?
Well, I think so. I mean, there is already, we see bias towards the sort of Zionist position. And you know, the ordinary people, and you know, your example of people sort of speaking or sending things is actually a reflection of what is really happening. Overwhelming majority of Europeans see Israel as a danger to the world peace. But our media, including BBC, doesn't reflect that. So we need to have other channels to actually bring some sort of balance.
I have to say, again, as a journalist, your experience, do you think the traditional media is losing its power in this age of social media?
Very much so, and I'd have to agree with Masood. I think we have to capitalise on what is happening and make sure that other channels, alternative channels, the ones that are actually showing the genuine picture, regain the viewers that are being lost because the BBC is completely disappointing. Other mainstream channels obviously are disappointing. So they are turning to the alternative channels for information. And I think we need to capitalise on that and ensure that they do get the fair picture, the real picture, and obviously not the one that's tainted with the picture of Mark Regev and all his ridiculous discourse. I think they need to see the real pictures coming from Gaza, and this is a crucial moment. So we really need to capitalise, I think, on that.
There obviously is a lot of anger out there. We've seen that in the reports and what you guys have been saying. But the BBC ain't listening, are they? So where to now? What do you do?
It is very difficult. I think we need to keep going. I think people need to keep protesting. I think people need to keep writing to the BBC. That's very important because they do take on board. I mean, if you remember a very silly chapter, which was the Jonathan Ross scandal over a very silly and joke show very late at night, and still it actually pushed the BBC to react. So I think if enough people write, enough people complain, they will have to change. It's going to be a slow process, and obviously the external pressure that Masood was mentioning is going to be difficult to counter, but I think if we keep at it, something positive will come out of it.
Masood, is protesting enough? I mean, some politicians and activists have suggested boycotting the BBC licence fee.
Yeah, I think that is right for some activists to do and organise, but I don't really think overwhelming majority of people are going to be able to get involved in that sort of campaign. That's the nature of activists and campaigning.
Why? Because it's illegal.
Because it's illegal, and the SPACs want to make a lot of sort of change from their own.
But it would make them listen, surely, wouldn't it? Because it would hurt them in the pocket,
yeah,
right?
but that's almost like saying if you get every Brit put £1 aside for Gaza, we will have so many million. It's good as a sort of slogan, a theory, but it's not going to happen in reality. What I think is important, as she's saying, we need to actually get people to write in, etc. But also we need to empower our community. One of the things that we've been asking people to do is to actually put a flag outside their homes, their shops, their cars and so forth. Let us flood the whole streets of London and Britain with Palestinian flag. Then there is no doubt that people like BBC and others, they need to adhere to the empowerment of people, saying that they are fed up and they are supporting Palestinians because that is the right and just thing to do, and indeed forcing the institutions to actually take more notice.
Okay, well, we're out of time now, actually, so actually thanks a lot both of you for coming in today and kind of giving us your insight into what you think of the recent media coverage of the Gaza crisis. That is all the time we have for today. Once more, thank you to both our guests, and don't forget to get busy on our social media pages. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again next time for more discussion and analysis on Palestine. Bye-bye.